Today I'm going to show you a mastering processing sample of a song from a French artist called Magda Gianico. I don't know if I pronounced the name right. It is actually a French song with a lot of acoustic instruments mixed by Fab Dupont from Pure Mix, called Caramelle. To give you a first impression, we will make a loudness compensated A/B comparison using the smart bypass function of Wavelab 7. The level of the processed version is reduced by round about 5.5 dB, you can see that here. This makes it pretty easy to listen at the same level when we compare the original with the processed version. That is pretty important to hear the subtle differences in mastering. For your information, the output signal is tethered to 16-bit and re-recorded by the capturing software so that you have the best possible sound quality. Okay, here we go to listen. Okay, don't wonder about the glitches when I switch from original to processing. This is typical for Wavelab. Wavelab is basically a nice program, but with a little potential for optimization here and there. So this kind of artifacts are a little bit annoying and distracting when we concentrate on the details. I will now go through one plugin after the other to explain exactly what I've done. And don't wonder about the relatively low level. I leave this smart bypass here at processed with level deduction in order to avoid this 6 dB level jumps for you. If I would go to processed, or if I would leave the smart bypass function, the level would suddenly raise by 5.5 dB, and therefore I stay here. I start with the first plugin and I drag it over so that we have it here. Here we go. This is actually one of my favorite EQs. It's very practical that you can scale up the window. But this is not the reason why I like this EQ so much. It's a linear phase EQ and it sounds pretty neutral and clear, which makes the EQ ideal for surgical purposes. Unfortunately, this EQ is currently not available for Mac, but I just spoke with a programmer and they are working on a solution for that. The EQ is one of the most non-coloring EQs on the market, and I like to mix it with coloring EQs, as you will see later. For best quality, don't forget to tag the oversampling field. What I usually do first with such an surgical EQ is scanning the low-mid band for mumbling stuff in order to get rid of that. To follow me through the mastering process, I first switch all plugins off. I finally just leave the limiter on and set it back to 0 dB input amplification. This way the limiter just acts as an output protection and is so far sound neutral. Here it is. I drag it beside so that we have enough space for the other stuff. By the way, now is your signal further 3 dB quieter. I made that in order to be able to show you finally how I define this 3 dB level raise of the limiter at the end. Now we listen to the single bands of the algorithmic EQ. Here I choose the band, and by raising the band gain I show you why I have reduced this specific frequencies. I go to the next band You can clearly hear that this frequency is a little bit annoying. Next band. Okay, this has been the 3 suspicious frequencies I found in the low mid-range. Furthermore, I have a band here at about 4K. It's a very decent gain raise with a wide Q, we can hear with and without. You can hear that the EQ sounds very neutral, no filter sounds at all. Have in mind that you hear the activated EQ always a little bit delayed due to the high latency of this power-consuming EQ. And finally, I have a very decent shelving filter at 12K. Now I make a complete bypass, have in mind the delayed reaction. Yeah, it's pretty good to hear that the EQ is already cleaning up, especially in the low mid area. I now activate the external gear, which is connected through the DAAD converter. I just switch it on and off. As I can see here, the external gear is level corrected so that we have an even A-B comparison. Okay, listen to the external gear. Yes, I actually just have inserted an SPL tube vitalizer with almost 20 years old tubes, which sounds pretty warm and gives a little bit of low and cleans up a little bit the mid-range and enhances the airband a little bit. The tube vitalizer opens the sound actually a little bit and gives also a slight 3D effect into the depth. This piece of hardware is still not available as software, so I love to use it because it's pretty unique. Well, the next one is my favorite Studer A800 by UAD2. It's a pretty nice and valuable modeling of the original. I actually used to have one. I sold it about 15 years ago to Susan Vega, and I'm glad to have it back here from the UAD platform. This plugin actually has a fantastic 3D effect, especially in the low range area, so bass and kick drum very often appear more three-dimensional. And I choose the Ampex 456 tape. The 15 inch per second allows a little bit more tape saturation. Okay, here we go. Yes, the effect is very decent. In this case, you should have a good monitoring system or a very good headphone in order to be able to hear the details when we make the ABs. Listening at about 80 dB SPL sound pressure level makes it easier to listen to the details. My next plugin is the famous Pultec EQ, in this case the modeling by UAD2, and you can recognize that mastering is pretty often the politic of the cumulated small steps. It is actually common mastering practice to split the complete EQing to a number of different EQs to have a very discrete and decent EQing from each single EQ together, so that we have a less obtrusive result and we have kind of the sum of the positive phase effects of the EQs. In this case I have actually 4 EQs. It's the algorithmics red, it's the SPL tube vitalizer, and it's the Pultec and the Manley massive passive. You may ask why I have boosted and attenuated at the same time at 60 Hz. This creates a kind of soft shelving filter, boosting the bass a little bit and reducing the low mid-range. This is actually a very typical application for the Pultec EQ, so you can support the very low end and reduce the annoying low mid-range area. In the mid-range, these 3 knobs belong together. I put the bandwidth, which is the Q, to broad, which makes it very decent, and raised it about 2 at 4K. This is pretty important for the speech comprehensibility. I will raise it a little bit more drastically just to give you an idea about the sound flavor. This Pultec model works in 4 times oversampling, so it sounds pretty silky like the original. Okay? Without. Yes, usually the Pultec gives the impression to make more than he actually does. This is because the Pultec comes always with a slight gain raise of 0.5 to 1 dB. And this makes it appear to sound better. So to distinguish that, we need a loudness compensated AB comparison. But it makes a great sound at all, so this is not a problem. To figure that out, you can use the smart bypass when the Pultec is the only plugin in your master slot. Now I come up with the last EQ. It's the Manley massive passive. From the basic sound characteristic, it's pretty similar to the Pultec EQ, but the Pultec doesn't have sufficient bands. So when I need more, it makes sense to use the massive passive. It is here the master version of the UAD2, so your maximum potential gain or reduction is not that big than in the normal version. I had the desire to have an additional bell at 2.2K and a shelving at 12K. As said before, I apply the politic of the small steps to create a very discrete result. If we would do all these steps with just one EQ, we would have a high risk of filter noises. Compared to the Pultec, the massive passive has the benefit of having 4 bands with distinct frequency and Q. Despite that, I would count the massive passive to the aesthetical EQs. Let's go. Okay, in order to show you the character of the EQ, I pull up the two bands I've used and then I go back to the value I have picked before. Yes, when you hear this soft and silky highs, you can think, why don't he pull up more of that? This is because I have to be very careful, especially with this song, because of the very different parts with different instrumentation. At the end we have a lot of strings which react different to a lot of raised highs. And at the beginning we have a spot where the kick stands almost alone with the vocals, and if it's getting too boomy, it's annoying. So you're always good off to verify your master setup at different spots in the song. Therefore I try to carefully support the openness of the song without changing the frequency distribution overall. Here we come to one of my favorite plugins. It's the K-Stereo by Algorithmics. It's an invention by my colleague Bob Katz, and it's already available also on UAD2. This one is from Algorithmics, but I haven't checked them out against each other. The only area or genre where you have to be very careful with this plugin is everything in the area of dance and electronic music, where the kick is very dry and is supposed to be dry, so you have a slight risk with the K-Stereo to get too much room onto the playback and getting a kind of spongy kick. So if you want to have a complete dry and up into the face kick, you are not so good off with the K-Stereo, but for all other music genres it's a pretty nice and unique plugin to enhance the ambience and to create more depth and kind of unity of the complete sound. Ambience processor means so far that you have the possibility to treat the ambience portion of the whole music different. Yeah, this is quite interesting. Here at the right you can see the EQ. You have a low cut, high cut and a parametric section, and the EQ just affects the ambience portion of the whole thing. So this is pretty interesting if you have, for example, an annoying mumbling lower mid-range sound of the room, of the recording room on your recording. Then you can get rid of that a little bit, and on the other hand you can increase the ambience portion to give the sound more depth and to create more unity. So that works pretty well. In this case I have a dip at 200 Hz to reduce the low mid-range of the room and a low cut, and here we go. Yes, I like it pretty much. It gets more 3D, it gets more depth, and it's getting a little bit wider. Very pleasant. So the next plugin is the Transient Modulator by Sonox. It's also a very nice and unique tool to bring back, in this case it's not necessary to bring something back because the mix is pretty nice, but it's a kind of fresh cell cure for the music. I use it pretty often, and especially if I'm getting overcompressed mixes, which is not the case here, but it brings a little bit, or it increases the vitality of the sound, and it opens it psychoacoustically more for the human hearing. This works pretty well. You have to be careful with two things with this plugin, so watch the over indicator, you don't want to have it in the over area, and you should be very careful with this ratio, so you can increase the kick and the snare drastically. Yes, in this setting it's pretty decent. Please listen to the transients, what happens with the transients, and I will raise the ratio by far too much and you will hear what happens. Yes, that was pretty good to hear. So now we come to a very complex piece of gear. It's the MD3. This is actually a kind of standard in mastering studios since almost 20 years. Invented the first time initially as the M5000 by TC, and then later integrated into the System 6000 and integrated to the PowerCore platform. Yes, the PowerCore platform is a little bit tricky and unreliable, I think, or I guess it's discontinued because of the problem with the drivers. But basically, if you just use the MD3, it works pretty nice. I'll lead you quickly through the unintuitive user interface. Here in the main window you have an MS matrix. This splits the signal into mono and side portion. This way I can treat the mono portion on the left channel and the side portion on the right channel. Picking the unlinked mode means that I can define different settings for the left and the right channel, ergo the M and S channel. If I have output mode left-right, we hear the M left and the S right as said before. And if we want to have the stereo signal, we need to dial in to decode. I leave it in left-right and mute the right channel so that we just hear the M channel on the left side. Here we have an EQ where we can switch between M and S signal. On the M channel I have a very decent gain raise of 0.5 dB at 460 Hz. And here I haven't used the expander at all, so that we go on to the compression section, where you can see the M area. I have applied an even compression, even threshold. I picked an RMS-oriented threshold detection in the main menu, which is kind of beneficial for this specific application here in mastering. With the S-band it becomes a little bit more interesting now. I have raised the mid and the high band of the S signal slightly by 0.5 dB, which is enough in this case to widen up the whole sound. You will hear that. This increases the stereo bass slightly. Back to the main menu, you can see the fields where you define the crossover frequencies between low, mid and high band. In this case we have 250 Hz and 3.15 kHz. Here once again I show you that the threshold detection is RMS oriented and you can go gradually down to peak orientation, as you can see here. I set it back to RMS for this purpose. We now listen to what the MD3 does to the mono signal on the left channel. For people who are not used to MS processing, this might appear a little bit strange. The great thing with MS processing is that you can do things which you can't do on stereo signals on a regular basis. Sometimes you can even rescue somehow very problematic mixes. Yes, now we do the same thing with a side signal, Give me a second. By the way, regarding the EQ of the S portion of the signal, I have applied a decent low cut on the S signal, and I have emphasized 2 frequencies very gently. Going back to the main menu, I switch back from left-right to decoding so that we can actually hear what this plugin does. So as we all know, loud seems to be always better in A/B comparisons. So this way we can use the compare function here. You have to be careful with that because it's pretty easy to forget to switch it off afterwards. Now we just reduce the output by 2 dB when the plugin is active in order to have an even loudness. Now the processed signal should have the same level than the original so that we can focus on the details. Yes, the effect is pretty decent. It's getting a little bit wider and clearer, but we have raised the level by 2 dB, and in order to not forget to switch this compare function out, we now switch it out. Now we come to our final processing plugin. It's always the limiter. In this case, I use the Sonox limiter. It's a very, very nice sounding limiter, especially when you don't push it that hard. It also sounds relatively well when you push it hard, actually, but then you have to be a little bit careful with interleaved sample overs because the algorithm embedded here into this plugin is not compliant with R128, the latest recommendation by the EBU. Therefore, the output level is not true peak level, it's SPPM level. Usually I use an external true peak level meter in order to verify that. Here I now use my dynamic range meter, which I have actually developed for this purpose. I like to use the dynamic range meter as a tool to define how far I can go until the transients hit the max output volume, in this case minus 0.5 dB. In order to do so, I have to leave the smart bypass window, so be aware of a level raise of about 3 dB or a little bit more. I reset the meter and then I'm looking for the loudest part in the song. I think here is the loudest part of the song. Now let's see where we are. So we can see that the very highest peaks go to about minus 1.3, but these are just a few exceptions. So there's a good headroom for a decent level increase. I just gradually increase the input gain of the limiter. Here I can see when it actually starts to limit, and then I sequentially reset the TT dynamic range meter in order to observe how fast the limiter hits the signal against the ceiling of minus 0.5 dB in this case. If it's continuously sticking at minus 0.5 dB, I would have possibly gone too far with the limiter. So my aim in this case is to protect the inherent dynamic of the song. And on the other hand, if you see all the transients here in the waveform, we don't need them all to be so dynamic, so we can even that a little bit more out. Actually without reducing the perceptual dynamic. You can observe that the meter takes a while after reset to stick back to minus 0.1 dB. So I can just go a little bit further. I go to 3 dB, as I remember I had it there before. Okay, let's see how it looks now. Yes, we can see that it requires quite a few transients in order to hit the signal to minus 0.5, so it's pretty breathing, and we don't hit each transient to 0.5. Observe it once again. Yes, and on the other hand, on this dynamic range meter in this middle bar graph, I can see that we are approximately at this Norah-Jones loudness level of come along with me. So there's absolutely no reason to go further in this case, as instantly with 1 or 2 dB more loudness, we would destroy the inherent dynamic of the pleasant recording and mixing of the song. Finally, we will make a few A-Bs using the smart bypass function again. Let's go. You can hear that the whole mix opens up gently, but you also understand why I have not been able to raise more highs due to the strings at the end of the song. And finally we go to the intro of the song. Also here you can clearly see that more bass would have been too much bass. But I think we have a good balance now. The whole mix comes a little bit more out of the loudspeaker access into the room. It appears more pleasant to the listener, and the speech comprehensibility is increased, is raised. It's easier to understand the singer even if you can't understand French. Okay, in the future you will find other videos like this for other genres, for other case studies. I hope this was informative and interesting for you and fun too. Thank you very much and see you soon. Bye bye.